Chapter 7, Town Life. They went into camp again, and this time they sat for 3 months. They were there so long they thought of the camp as a town and gave the paths between the tents street names based on Minnesota towns. Soon signs were stuck on poles: Winona Avenue, Taylor Falls Street. It went from summer into fall, and they cut trees and made log shanties and drilled in the rain and then snow, but spent most of their time in the log huts, plugging leaks, keeping out cold wind, and trying to get their clothes dry. They were rarely successful. Disease spread through the camp like fire as the weather worsened, and with the disease came the rumors. It was said that McClellan was afraid to fight. Almost all the men, including Charlie, loved the new commander and felt that he was only trying to be easy on the men by avoiding a winter campaign. But the rumors said that Lincoln, most of the men also loved the president and called him Old Rail Splitter, was very dissatisfied with McClellan's lack of bite and wanted some attack made on the rebels somewhere at some time soon. This did not translate into action, and the men sat another month, getting sicker and sicker, both physically and in their spirits. Rumors said that a whole regiment from New York had deserted and gone home. It turned out not to be true. 4 men had deserted from a New York regiment and had been caught and tried and shot by firing squads, but it showed the lack of morale. Another rumor said that a young general named Grant out west in Tennessee had fetched the rebels such a hit that he'd whipped their western army, and that Grant was a drunk, and that Lincoln had said, "Find out what kind of whiskey he's drinking and send a case to all the generals." This proved to be the truth, but none of it really mattered to Charlie. Like most of the men, he worked at taking care of himself. It kept him busy. The camp was worse than a pigsty. Men from the country, most of the Minnesota volunteers, knew of country living. They dug holes for latrines, kept their areas cleaner than others, and worked at getting good shelter. Men from cities, New Yorkers were the worst, had little concept of living with the land and no idea how to take care of themselves. They left sewage in the open, didn't drain the slops from their shelters, and consequently were virtually destroyed by disease. Some New York companies lost more than half their men to dysentery, typhus, measles, and diarrhea, which soon spread to other units. It seemed somebody was always either getting sick, was sick, or was getting over something. Charlie and the rest were kept moving, just working at repairing the shelter, keeping it clean and cooking. The food was simple and, for the most part, beans, always beans, salt pork, and coffee. Soon a bakery with wood-fired ovens was going, and bread was doled out to the men. The plan was to give each man a pound of bread a day, but it rarely worked out that well. The sutlers kept plying their trade and brought cakes and pies and cookies to the men, but the prices went up 50 cents for a cake that tasted as if it was made of wood, and most of the men only bought from the sutlers in dire emergency. Charlie once relented and bought an apple pie, but when he sat down to eat it, there were only 3 small slices of apple in it and nearly no sugar. If they had the ingredients housewives on nearby farms cooked and sold meals to the men. But getting food this way was chancy, to say the least. There were over 90,000 men in the camp and perhaps 20 farms where food might be available. To feed all the men 3 meals a day, the farm wives would have had to make 13 to 15,000 meals a day each. Besides, The officers seemed to get most of this good food. Officers were initially the only ones allowed whiskey as well. Charlie didn't drink, but like everybody else thought it unfair in the extreme that only officers were considered able to handle it. There was a small mutiny among some of the units, and soon whiskey was made available to all troops. Although the enlisted men were to be issued it by the sutlers, a shot a day, to ward off the ague, chill, and fever of winter camp, and were supposed to drink it right where it was issued. There was very little that was fair about the whole situation, at least from Charlie's viewpoint, and it quickly became obvious to him that it was every man for himself. He became adept at camp survival. He pulled his own weight, took his turn gathering food and wood, and cleaning and cooking, but he made a private world for himself where he kept his thoughts and knowledge. He worked constantly on his equipment, shining the leather, changing his cartridges if they became damp or seemed even a bit moist, and most of all, tending to his feet and his rifle. "Charlie, you're going to wear that rifle out," a man named Campbell told him one night while they sat by the trench stove. They had learned how to dig a trench a foot wide and a foot deep along the floor of their shelter, then out under a wall and into the open. The trench was covered with flat rocks and a barrel placed over the opening outside to make a passable chimney. When the men built a fire in the trench inside the log hut, the rocks would become hot and heat the whole shelter. Charlie looked up at Campbell, then back to his rifle. He had forgotten none of what had happened. He knew it would come again. It had to come again because they were there. It had to come again because they were here. You did not have an army without a battle. It was what the generals wanted, what they needed, a battle to use their armies. On both sides, it was all up to the generals, the officers. If it was left up to the men who did the killing and dying, there would be no war. Death would still come. "I'll be needing this rifle," he spoke down, as if talking to the weapon. He did not like to look at people as much as he once did. He did not like to learn about them. It was better if he didn't know them, become too friendly with them. They died so fast. "Pshaw! We'll be in this camp all winter. They ain't gonna fight when it's cold." Charlie said nothing, but he remembered a night on guard duty down along the river. He was put on picket duty, making sure there would be a warning if the Rebs on the other side of the river decided to attack. That night, he was hunkered down behind an oak to get out of the wind. It was so cold he was reminded of Minnesota, and he heard a voice come from across the river, low and in a soft drawl. "Hey, Union, can you hear me?" Charlie didn't answer. "Bluebelly, are you deaf?" Oh well, Charlie thought, why not talk to them? "What do you want?" "Just to talk. Maybe do a little trading." "Trade bullets," Charlie said. "That's all you want." "Naw, it's too cold to fight. I've got me some good cut tobacco over here. You got any coffee? We're down to burned oats for coffee of a morning." As it happened, Charlie had an extra half-pound of coffee beans he'd been issued that afternoon. For months, they hadn't had coffee at all, and had been using burned oats themselves for a hot morning drink. But when ration came, as usual, the army would get it wrong and issue triple rations. Now there was a glut of coffee. Charlie didn't use tobacco, but he knew men who did, and Southern tobacco was much better than the foreign tobacco available to the Union Army now that the South had seceded. He could trade the tobacco for bread, pies, and leather to fix his shoes. "How we going to trade?" Charlie called back. "I got me a plank. I'll throw a line over to your side on a rock, and you pull the plank across with the tobacco, and I'll pull it back with the coffee. Don't you shoot me when I stand up." "I won't." There was a half moon, and Charlie peeked around the oak and watched as a slight figure stood up across the river. He was dressed poorly, his feet wrapped in what looked like sacks, and his coat tattered and worn. Even in the moonlight, he could see that the boy's face was dirty. He thought, "I probably look the same." But the Reb looked even younger than Charlie. "Mind the stone," the boy called, and threw a rock with a string tied to it. The river was 40 feet wide, and the string snarled on the first toss, and he had to retrieve it and toss it twice more before the rock made it. Charlie moved from behind the oak and picked up the string. He kept low, couldn't help it, but in a few minutes he had pulled the board across the river and found the tobacco wrapped in a cloth. He wrapped his coffee beans and put the package on the plank. "All right, pull it back," he called, and the piece of wood made its way back across the water. Charlie watched it until it reached the other bank, and then he moved behind the oak, squatted down out of sight, and tucked the tobacco inside his coat. "Hey, Bluebelly, you still there?" "I'm here. This coffee looks good. Can you get more?" "Some." "Let's trade again tomorrow night. I can get all the tobacco you need." "All right." There was another silence. Then, "Where are you from, Union?" "Minnesota." "Where's that?" How could he not know where Minnesota was? "Up north of Iowa." "Oh." "I'm from Alabama." "You a farmer?" "I worked on farms." "Me too." "What do you grow?" "Potatoes, corn, squash, wheat, and oats. And barley." "Same as us, except we have greens and baccy and some rice in the bottoms." "This is right stupid, ain't it?" "What?" "Here we be, both farmers, talking and trading goods, and tomorrow or the next day, we got to shoot at each other." "I hope," Charlie thought, "you don't hit me." "Ain't it stupid?" the boy asked. "Yes." "I've got to go now. My trick is near up. I'll yell for you tomorrow night." And that was it. There was no further talk or trading because an officer had heard Charlie and jumped him about speaking to the enemy. And the same must have happened to the Reb, because the next night Charlie leaned against the oak and somebody fired from the other side of the river and drew splinters off the tree 4 feet over his head. The truce was over.